Our next panel is an exciting one. I think we'll bring some energy to this. It's more of a positive thing than the doom and gloom we talked about a lot this morning. So our next panel exemplifies what we mean by multi-benefit agriculture. We'll learn how California's rice lands are producing not just food, but critical habitat and ecosystem services as well. A lot to discuss, a lot to unpack from this. So please welcome to the stage Adam Putnam, CEO of Ducks Unlimited, Tim Johnson, President and CEO of the California Rice Commission, Dr. Jacob Katz, Senior Scientist at California Trout, and Secretary Wade Crowfoot, Secretary for the California Natural Resources Agency.
Well, thank you, everybody, for coming back from break. I'm always a little worried. We get to a good break, you look at the next agenda item, and you go, holy crap, I'm not going to sit through that. Appreciate the opportunity to talk to you a little bit today about a project that we have launched, which is the subject of today's discussion, which is the rice footprint. I'll just have a few slides and kind of just walk you through what the rice footprint is, how we see it kind of playing out in the next decade. And it really does connect our growers who grow America's sushi rice, right? Almost every piece of sushi in the United States that you would eat is made from rice grown right here in the Sacramento Valley. We also, as all of agriculture is in California and across the U.S., hugely important to rural California, right? Little towns where we grow rice, Calusa, Williams, Richvale, places like that are agriculture, right? Largely rice in those cases, but we also have nuts, we have tomatoes, of course, many other crops in those regions. But let's talk about rice. So first, the rice footprint is really based off of, kind of anchored to a report that was done at UC Davis just at the beginning of this year. And really what we sought to do is to take the acres, the locations, and the management practices of rice lands and look at it from a multi-species perspective. Now, my friends at Ducks, ducks and rice have been pals forever, right? Since we stopped burning rice straw. But really to look at it from species beyond that and really look at it in a holistic perspective. As we got into this project with UC Davis, I think it's important to note what Dr. John Eady reflected back to us. This is really a one-of-a-kind report in the United States. Never before have we looked at multi-species benefits at a landscape level in the U.S. that he was aware of. So I'm just going to do some pullouts from this very long report and let you know what some of the specific species needs or benefits from rice is. So waterfowl, of course, hugely dependent on rice. 500,000 acres of rice is what really needs to be grown for waterfowl. But importantly, we need about 258,000 acres of rice winter flooded, right? That time after the straw, leftover straws in the field, we want to decompose that straw. There's a number of ways we can do that. Not all of them involve winter flooding. Waterfowl in particular need that straw decomp water. What about shorebirds? California rice fields are also known as shorebird habitat of international significance. They need slightly fewer acres of rice, but more winter flooded rice acres. And something we'll talk about at the end, they need slightly different winter flooded rice acres, and they need them at a different time of year and a different depth. One of the interesting facts for you all is that about 100% of the breeding population of black terns in California can be found in our rice fields. In fact, I see John Munger here today with Montana Farms. Next week, we'll be sending a photographer out to go take pictures of black terns actually nesting in a rice field. Salmon, that's sort of a new area of exploration for us. 300,000 acres of rice in those bypasses, right? That Yolo-Sutter bypass area. And 200,000 to 300,000 acres of rice outside those bypasses where the fish can't necessarily come onto a rice field, eat the zooplankton that grow in our fields in the winter and then swim back out. If a salmon can't do that, can we get the food to the salmon as it swims by in the river, the small little juvenile salmon? The answer is yes, and they need a lot of acres of that. Favorite pull quote from the report: the footprint of bypass rice fields needed for salmon, quite simply, all of them. Giant garter snake. Unbeknownst to us, Roger Nilo, senator here from Sacramento, is running a bill this year to make the giant garter snake the state snake. Who would have thought? At the same time we were writing this report, rice fields have become increasingly important, and it's increasingly known for their habitat for giant garter snake. 83,000 acres, important surrogate habitat, but more importantly, where those acres are at. They need to be close to a wildlife refuge so that those snakes can use the refuge, they can use a rice field, and importantly, also use our irrigation conveyances. So when you add all of this up, what does it look like? It looks at sort of a rice footprint, right? This idea that as long as we're growing 470,000 acres of rice, the species should be in good shape, right? If it drops below 375,000, we are really having a difficult time. And there's that middle area, that area of warning, right? And so I would say from our perspective, the red, yellow, green's a perfect way to look at rice acres from a habitat perspective, from a multi-species perspective. Green, we're fine. Yellow, we really need to be making sure that every acre of rice that we are planting, right, is doing maximum value for the environment, for habitat. And 375, I would say even more so. And you can think about the drought that we had in 2022. So what's next? And you can see a map off to the side there. Just know that the colors represent some really interesting overlays, right? Again, we said this was a multi-species look at rice. That's the Sacramento Valley. The blue are the refuge areas, private and public wetlands. Yellow would be a single species is benefited by rice. And as you get to those colors that are closer to orange and red and even that dark color purple, as many as 4 different species that we looked at in this report, of course there are many more, are dependent on those rice acres. So what are we going to be doing? We're really going to be working to protect the rice acres, that 470 and above, and enhance the value of those rice acres across species. Things like the Salmon Regional Conservation Partnership Program, RCPP, giant garter snake science. We also think there's some opportunities for programs specifically targeted giant garter snake. Short-term easements, and for my DU friends, I wrote contracts in there. And the idea is that some growers can go ahead and pursue a permanent easement, right? That works for their operation. They've answered the question, what happens the next generation and the generation after that? Ends up being in rice, that's a smaller number than our total growers, certainly. But a grower would sign up for a 15-year contract to make sure that you can go ahead and flood those winter rice acres that we talked about being so important. Permanent easements, of course, work with Ducks Unlimited, California Waterfowl, others on permanent ag easements, which we're all familiar with. And then look at policy as well in the state of California. How can this report from UC Davis, really a first of its kind, help inform California policy? And I firmly believe that the value of this report will live on in a footprint 2.0, right? Think about the colors on the map that are next to you. Think about we have a drought. Another drought, it's significant. Think about where exactly should we be deploying those dollars? Where should we be maybe pumping some groundwater strategically? Well, the answer is found in a map like this, but 2.0 even more so, where we have dollars that you can deploy to certain species benefits at specific times of year. So really, again, look to maximize that value of the rice footprint. So that really concludes what the rice footprint is, set the stage for you for this discussion, because in fact, this rice footprint isn't something that just rice does alone, right? We do it with our partners. We do it with Ducks Unlimited. We do it with California Trout. We do it with Northern California Water Association. And we do it with the administration, right? We do it with natural resources and all of the agencies, of course, that we work with on an ongoing basis. But this, again, really provides that idea of that holistic view of what does rice mean in the Sacramento Valley that has lost 95% of its wetland habitat. How can we help? How can we work with the public and private wetlands to make sure that that habitat that is remaining is there and in good shape for the species that need them? So with that, I'll turn it over to the moderator.
Thank you for that. I appreciate that. Very interesting. A lot to unpack out of that. I'm sure we can talk about it for a long time. But before we move on to the next presentation, I just want to touch on this a little bit and you set the stage. I want to unset the stage and take it back to 2022 and talk a little bit more about that drought there and kind of the need that drove this report. Tim? Oh, take it back to 2022. So we'll go back to when there's a drought. Yeah.
In 2022, right, we saw the bottom end of that scale. We grew 253,000 acres of rice in the state, right? So suddenly we found ourselves, I think the year before that, we were maybe in around the 425 range, and then suddenly we dropped to 256,000 acres of rice. And in some cases in the Sacramento Valley, almost none, right, on entire western side of the Sacramento Valley. And for us, that was what really made us think about, you know, the impact of climate, the impact of urbanization over time on agriculture, on rice agriculture, really meant that we passed yellow and just went straight to the bottom. If that is going to be more so the case in the future, you know, how do we look at rice in a more comprehensive fashion? How is it not just growing rice? We knew giant garter snakes were going to have a tough time making it on the western side of the Sacramento Valley. They are not as mobile, right, as waterfowl. So really that crisis from 2022 really spurred our industry to, again, take that holistic, broader view of what rice meant to the Sacramento Valley.
Great, and just one other quick question, if you don't mind. So this came out in January, I believe it was. You were talking about policy and hoping to influence some decision makers here. Has there been any response since then? Anything that you could share with us?
You know, I'd say the response has really been very positive, very much. You know, again, I think we knew in rice that we had this great symbiotic relationship with waterfowl. But to be able to look at it from a multi-species perspective has been eye-opening. And just the understanding of the value of working agricultural lands, right? Not just from an open space perspective, certainly from a food security and all the things we in agriculture talk about, but every single crop in California has something that it brings to the working land sort of mosaic. For us, it's that surrogate wetland, right? Again, 95% of the wetlands are gone, but the critical role that rice lands, working lands play from a policy perspective, I think as we've introduced this report, which is what we've done these last few months, really setting ourselves up for the discussions that will occur this time next year, the reception has been overwhelmingly positive.
Nice, great, really interesting. All right, Jacob, I'm going to have you jump up here. You got a presentation as well for us to dive into fish a little bit more and some fascinating research.
What I'd like to talk about today is a trade-off that I think most people feel is inevitable, that between the capacity of the landscape to produce wild abundance, skies turned black with ducks and geese, rivers full of salmon, and the landscape that I've grown up in, that you all work in, agricultural abundance, right? And I think the Sac Valley has a really, really important place, a story to tell that says that trade-off is not inevitable. And the science is clear that so many of the symptoms that we see of a system under stress, endangered species causing regulatory gridlock, those aren't necessarily an inevitable outcome of development. They're a very specific outcome of the way in which we have developed. And what I want to talk about is how the Sac Valley is really showing, demonstrating that another future is possible. So before the Sac Valley was this amazing mosaic, this tapestry of ag productivity that we know it today, it was a tapestry of wetlands, a mosaic of water interacting with landscape over really broad ranges and over long periods of time. Every spring and every winter with snow melt or rain, the rivers would swell, they would flow over their banks, and they would create puddles, wetlands. Now, reactivating those historic wetlands is obvious to everybody here that that would make a lot of sense to puddle ducks, right? It's right there in the name. But what I want to talk to you about today is learning from the incredible hope that the resurgence of migratory waterfowl and waterbirds that has happened here over my lifetime, over the last 35 years in this valley. We've seen a change. When I was a kid and rice was burned, ducks were at all-time low numbers. They were not listed yet, but we're on that trajectory. And today we have, for decades now, been seeing surging populations to the point where geese now are an agricultural pest again, right? That's actually an incredible success story. And does it mean we have to deal with it? Yes. But it means that a return to natural abundance is entirely possible. And it's not possible by removing humans from the landscape. We didn't do that. As Tim was just saying, changes in the way that we live on this landscape, that we farm, that we manage our waters and our rivers, fundamentally changed the way that ducks and geese and shorebirds could recognize the heart of the Pacific Flyway. They could recognize the valley, the river valley, that they evolved in and that they're adapted to. And what did they do? They responded with incredible exuberance. And the story that I want to tell you builds on that success story. A success story not just important to California, but to the nation as one of the great environmental success stories that we actually have globally. And now the science is showing that those same wetlands, and wetlands again, are not just a place, they're a pattern. What's a puddle? It's water out there on the landscape for a long period of time, right? And think about your fields, think about a parking lot or your suburban street, really just about anywhere within the human landscape. We hurry that water off that landscape as quick as possible. It's as if we abhor a puddle. Anywhere, at landscape scale anyway, except in rice country. Rice country's amazing. We actually, on purpose, hold that shallow water on the landscape for months at a time. Now, granted, we're doing that in summer during the growing season to make food and profit for people. But what we've seen is that same infrastructure, the irrigation infrastructure, the drainage infrastructure, can be used, can be reoperated to create the sequence of patterns that ducks and geese were familiar with, the wetlands. So the same farm field that makes food for people in summer can make food and habitat for ducks and geese in fall. And here's the story about fish that I want to tell, about how those same landscapes, those same fields, can create really high quality habitat and energy sources for California salmon. So we have this amazing success story on farming and conservation on the same landscape, right? That habitat isn't a place, it's a sequence of biological and physical patterns. When you do that, when you make that pivot, when you understand that it's not either or, that it's about understanding that the wetlands are still here, what's changed is how we manage the water that flows across them, all kinds of possibilities become possible. And we get those possibilities by something simple, by looking back, by understanding the interaction of water and the landscape through which that water flowed. And if we can mimic those patterns within the landscapes that we manage, that we live on, we can get unbelievable change. So what you're looking at is River Garden Farms over a typical winter flooded rice field at the congregations of snow geese that really are remarkable. And I say this because of this idea of a return to wildlife abundance. We live in this idea of natural scarcity. Look at this, look at the screen. These birds are about to take out my drone, right? Wait for it, they're gonna come after it. But that abundance you feel in your chest. If you see a liftoff from Gray Lodge up in the Butte Sink at dawn, you don't just see it, you feel it. You hear it in the shaking of your rib cage. That kind of abundance is possible again, even within this incredibly agriculturally intensively managed system. And for salmon, what we found was that those wetlands were just as much the buffet, the energy source, that they are for ducks and ducklings. The capacity of a valley to make wild biomass, whether that be ducks or fish, happens in wetlands. And it happens as water moves out across the landscape and accesses stored solar energy. Everything we grow, right, it's just capturing sunlight through photosynthesis and turning it into sugar. But that sugar's stored out on the landscape. So when we straitjacket our rivers, when we separate our aquatic ecosystem from the energy source out there on the landscape, guess what we do? Not purposefully, but really effectively. We cut out the productive capacity of a river valley to actually make salmon. We have created our own regulatory issues, not out of necessity, but out of ignorance. And what we have the capacity to do is to manage shallow water inundation of our floodplains in winter, whether it be the Sacramento or the San Joaquin, and in so doing, re-access that amazing ability to make, in this case, fish. The small fish that you see on the top of this slide is actually a very common sight in the Sac Valley. Coming out of the Yuba and Feather River alone, after a good return of adult salmon, the next spring can see almost 100 million fish that size move down into levied rivers. Those small fish we rarely see again. They just don't have the capacity. They haven't packed a lunch. They're not able to make their journey to the sea and return. The fish below is the same age as the one above, but has spent 3 weeks on the other side of the levee out on the floodplain, doubling its size every week. And this is what that looks like. Well, let's hope. Do you know if we can make this play? Oh, excellent. It's not on this one. Thanks, guys. So this is what happens. This is the making of a floodplain fatty, right? It doesn't take long when these fish are out in those flooded rice fields, which teem with insects. They're swimming around with their eyes closed and their mouth open, accessing the energy that we've denied them for about a century. What we're talking about is the capacity to reinvigorate a river ecosystem. And we do that not by getting out of the way, but by actively managing to mimic and approximate the natural patterns that create natural productivity and that allow us to get out of a regulatory gridlock that sometimes feels impossible. So I'd just like to say we're not doing this alone by any means. Tim talked about Ducks Unlimited and the Rice Commission and NACWA and Trout coming together in an MOU based on this idea that a river is not a thin blue line, but is really the summation of interaction between water and the landscape through which that water flows. And when you take that bigger look, when you start to think of habitat not as a place, but as a sequence of events that we actually have the capacity to manage and to allow our native biota, whether it be garter snakes or cottonwoods or salmon, to recognize the river valley that they are adapted to, we have the capacity for a totally different outcome. Not a future of scarcity like the one that we have now, but a return to abundance. And there is now a portfolio of fish and wildlife projects from ridgetop to river mouth through the Sacramento Valley that is endorsed by a consortium of the largest ag producers in the valley, the oldest ranches, the water suppliers that allow that ag endeavor to persist and to prosper, the conservation agencies, whether they're nonprofits, whether they're fins or feathers, the local, state, and federal regulatory agencies, which which are so important in their partnership to make an ecologically functioning Sacramento Valley capable of producing not just wildlife abundance and agricultural productivity that sustains vibrant rural communities, but delivering California's most important resource, water, directly into the fourth largest economy on Earth. So I'd love for you guys to look out and look up, just Google floodplain forward. There's a pile of pamphlets outside, but just this time, how long's it been now, Wade? Since last October, I believe. That coalition of willing partners came together with our family of state and federal resource agencies, and everybody came together in the same room to say, hey, we believe the Sac Valley can once again be a place of both environmental and agricultural productivity, but in order to do that, we have to invest at an unprecedented scale. But we know what that looks like because it was the scale of the return of ducks and geese and shorebirds. And at that scale, hundreds of thousands of acres, we believe we can also rebuild our salmon stocks and build a better future for the Sacramento Valley and the state. Thank you.
That might be our okay. That might be our most inspirational story of the day. Actually, I think it's gonna give you a run for the money here. We got 2 secretaries. We'll have to beat that. So yeah, jumping.
How could he beat it?
So jumping more into this conversation here, can I get some responses to this as well? But I want to quick switch it over to Secretary Crowfoot here and see get your thoughts on this research, on the report, and give us a little insider perspective to some of the policy stuff going on that's helped made this kind of stuff possible.
Yeah, well, thank you. And I got to say, I'm much happier listening to you than talking. I mean, this is something special is happening in the Sacramento Valley and has been happening in the Sacramento Valley for a long time. And this partnership that you see represented on this stage is a paradigm shift. It's a difference maker. I mean, with Ducks Unlimited, you have the original American conservationists that actually stood up programs to build healthy landscapes that we're still utilizing. With the rice growers, you have arguably the most, one of the most visionary agricultural producers in the country understanding this opportunity. And then you have Trout and Jacob, which are roll up the sleeves, get it done people that are about transcending the conflict to actually getting things done. And I'll tell you what, in my job, I confront a lot of zero-sum conflict. Water for agriculture or the environment. Land for agriculture or the environment. And this is a departure, and it doesn't have to be like that. In fact, it can't be like that. What's happening here is special, but I also want to say these partnerships are achievable and happening across California. We're working with alfalfa growers in the Imperial Valley, the other side of the state, to help stabilize the Salton Sea, improve air quality, and bring back birds in that part of California. We're working with almond growers in the Central Valley under the leadership of Secretary Ross, improving the health of our soils, bringing back pollinators. And so it's a mindset shift. And the fact is, we need more food. We need to continue to produce food. 1, because the world needs it, California needs it. 2, it's the economic lifeblood of our rural communities. And we also need a healthy environment. We need healthy air, we need healthy water, we need healthy natural systems. So it can't be an or, it has to be an and. And in an era of some limitations on our resources, think water, think funding, we have to think differently. So to me, this is a win-win-win. It's about optimizing the funding, the private investment, the public investment. It's about optimizing the use of water to continue to grow a product that we need and support fish and wildlife. So, I mean, I couldn't be more inspired and more supportive of this effort. And we're trying to, do whatever we can to help these folks succeed. And I have to say, a lot of it is getting out of the way. We have a regulatory system in California. This will be a news flash to you in agriculture. that is outdated. We need to do things in California. We need to move fast. We need to think and act differently. And we have regulatory constructs that make that very difficult. Jacob, for example, has been frustrated for the last decade because we make it really hard to flood up rice fields, produce a lot of food, and then put that food back into the river to feed fish. Not because we're trying to cause cow trout to fail, but we have really outdated, compartmentalized regulatory constructs. So that MOU that you saw people signing, myself included, is all about trying to get federal agencies, state agencies, local agencies, local water irrigation districts, conservation groups, all rowing in the same direction. And it's our commitment in government to actually help you figure out the way forward on these types of partnerships. And I have to say, I'm really optimistic moving forward. Clearly, there's a lot of difference between California state government and the new federal administration on a lot of topics, but I actually think this project isn't one of them. That we have groups like Ducks Unlimited that works really effectively in a bipartisan basis across the country to get these types of projects done. We have the rice growers and the agricultural producers in California. Yes, first and foremost, it's about protecting this economy, this sector, and it's about finding the like-minded partners to get things done. So to me, I'm so glad that you Agri-Pulse invited this panel here, because I think it's a story that we have to hear. And if we're successful in California on rice and on this partnership, I think it builds momentum for this paradigm shift that we desperately need.
Okay, great, yeah. And Adam, I want to bring you into the conversation here and get your perspective on this, particularly when we're talking about MOUs and kind of a little bit of the buildup that led into this kind of what used to be kind of an uncanny alliance between these organizations. And if you can, give us a little perspective on how this compares from your seat to we're talking about rice specifically, I guess, right now, but to projects across the country, other things that you've worked on.
Well, thank you, and it's certainly a pleasure to be here with our partners and honored to be part of Agri-Pulse's tremendous work that they do to shine a light on ag policy that drives everything that we do. Ducks Unlimited fundamentally believes that working lands, farmers and ranchers, are our partners in conservation. My background before coming to DU as CEO was as ag secretary, or we call it commissioner, in Florida for 8 years prior to joining DU. So it is very much a pro-ag, pro-property rights approach to solving wildlife and conservation challenges, particularly ducks and other waterfowl. Over the last 50 years, we've lost every population of birds has declined in North America with one exception, waterfowl. And it is directly attributable to the consistent focus that organizations like DU has had on habitat. Where is most of that habitat? On farms and ranches. And the best of that habitat for generating the energy, the calories that migratory birds need is on rice. And so when you were talking about when you see a drought in California, it not only impacts California bird populations, it causes the demise or the crash of an entire flyway, the entire Pacific flyway, which is from just east of the Rockies all the way to the Pacific Ocean. And so it's a big deal for us. It is scalable. It is not just here in California, but California is sort of first and best at it, but it is scalable in the Mississippi Alluvial Valley. You think about rice production in places like Arkansas and Mississippi. You think about the Texas and Louisiana Gulf Coast, other areas where we can apply some of these approaches. And in fact, 1 in 4 rice acres in America is under some form of partnership with Ducks Unlimited. So rice and ducks, far and away, are a tremendous partner in the commodity space, with livestock being sort of a distant second, particularly in the Prairie Pothole region in the Dakotas of the U.S. and Canada. And so this idea is that ag, we all know it as farmers and ranchers, and I'm a 5th-generation farmer and rancher from Florida. We know that what agriculture does has other benefits for which farmers and ranchers are not compensated and frequently aren't even recognized for. This is an example of this multi-species management where we know that farmers and feathers and fins are beneficial to one another, but this MOU and this intentional approach to the strategy of adaptively managing these lands so that there's economic benefit for the family farmer and there's ecological benefit for all of society from all of the good that these farmers and ranchers are doing on their lands. That fundamentally is what this partnership is all about.
And I want to kind of expand this a little bit more in California here as well. And we're talking a lot about Northern California, the Sacramento Valley. There's this whole ridgetop to river mouth idea. And I'd like to get a little bit more. We got a great question popping up from the audience here about water and how this relates to water storage. I know some of these conservation efforts actually benefit water retention as well, but they also open up this larger conversation about water. Tim, I don't know if you want to handle that or...
Yeah, so we've been talking about Sites Reservoir for a number of years, and I think the way to look at sites from an agricultural perspective, from a rice view, is it will allow us to maintain that rice footprint, right? I don't think we'll grow more acres because of sites, but we will be able to maintain those acres, right? Especially during those times where we have significant droughts, significant downturn, additional climate impacts. And so for us, that's how we're viewing it. It's an excellent opportunity. And keep in mind, sites, right, very different than previous projects. A significant benefit of sites is the environmental water that's going to be managed just for those other benefits. Some in the Sacramento Valley, some will be well beyond the Sacramento Valley. We've not had a project. The administration should be significantly complimented for supporting this multi-use reservoir that really provides another tool in the toolbox that we've desperately been lacking.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that, and I'll say, conditions are changing. We know this in California. We've experienced it. 2 so-called millennial droughts in the last 15 years. We can't sit on our hands. We have to modernize our systems to adapt to these changing conditions. Simply put, we have to capture water when it comes, these huge storms off the Pacific and big wet winters, to get us through these droughts that are going to become longer and more punishing. So Sites Reservoir, really key part of that, because it's going to help capture water off the Sacramento River, our biggest river system in California, during those big wet periods. And as Tim says, then park it in the Sacramento Valley for use by agriculture, but also by the environment, for environmental management, and frankly, by our cities too, for during those droughts. So that's just one of many infrastructure upgrades that we need, and we have to think about this infrastructure that can work, again, for people, for the economy, and for our natural systems.
Yeah, and by the way, we could do a whole day just doing the Wade Crowfoot conference, because you cover so much great stuff, and we're talking about water and fire and infrastructure, conservation. All these topics are really great, but one of the big things that everybody's watching right now is the voluntary agreements over at the Water Board. Since we're on the note of water already, how much do conservation projects, conservation efforts like this play into that whole discussion over voluntary agreements?
Yeah, so the whole idea is we've been in this downward spiral in California for quite a long time of regulation and litigation. So a lot of our most important water management decisions in the state are made by a federal judge in response to litigation and don't change for decades at a time. That's just not workable given these changing conditions and how dynamic the system is. So some of you in the room paired up with the state and federal government and said, we're going to do it in a different way. Yes, we have to improve water quality, environmental conditions in these rivers, but we're going to work with water agencies to figure out how we do that. So water agencies stepped up and said, we'll leave some water in the river. We'll also tax ourselves to get more habitat in the ground or around these rivers, these floodplains. The state stepped up. We're asking the feds to step up. So that's what these agreements are. They're a way to implement these standards that we know we need to meet for a lot of reasons, but in ways that work. And habitat is a big part of that. And what's interesting is that our regulatory body, the State Water Board, only has one lever to regulate, and that's the amount of water flowing down the river. But as Jacob would point out, that's not the key. That's not the only key to restoring these populations. We've got a lot of water pushing through these channelized rivers that predatory fish like striped bass are eating these undersized salmon. We got to get fish back on the floodplain. And the way to do that is actually get the state and our water agencies to fund more habitat. So I couldn't be more committed to getting these agreements done. And I think that they're, again, that shift from what's not working to what can work.
Yeah, great. One of the things that I enjoy covering when it's Department of Water Resources or the Water Board is getting down into the deeper realm when we're talking about mid-level staff who are on the ground every day, working with farmers, working with conservation groups, trying to piece together, even if it's just like smaller projects. It's this thing that we don't see too much in the news. And Jacob, I want to bring you back into this a little bit here. I was hoping that you could talk a little bit about kind of stepping out of your comfort zone to kind of work with other folks. This is not exactly your uncomfort zone because I know your dad was a farmer too, and you kind of come from this ground. But you know, have you been able to share some of this inspiration with other collaborations?
Yes, the answer is, and I think that it's not me. It's and it's not the science even. It's keeping it simple. It's the fact that the ducks and the fish, so that real hope is here. That it's not about going back. We know that going back's impossible. But if we look back, if we understand how our river valleys functioned and mimic that in the way that we live, in the way that we manage, we see this incredible natural exuberance come back so quickly. And it's not just ducks that have seen this success. In the midst of the Sacramento Valley is the small watershed of Butte Creek. And in the mid-90s, again, really galvanized by Ducks Unlimited, but with an amazing coalition of farm and regulatory, state, and water user investment, Butte Creek saw this amazing transformation from just a couple dozen returning spring Chinook salmon to thousands to tens of thousands, and sustained that incredible production for decades. Why? Why this anomalous little creek in the midst of this agricultural landscape? What happened there that was different? And it's a simple answer: puddles. Butte Creek's the only watershed in the entire state where salmon can swim down their channel, down their path, but that path connects directly to the Butte Sink and then to the Sutter Bypass. So the landscape itself and the people that are out there on the landscape came together in that place to show that if you have every link in the chain, the natural world will take care of itself. It'll come back. And so we were talking about infrastructure, talking about gathering together, but what we're really talking is about imagination. That how could puddles possibly be revolutionary? But they are.
Yeah, we'll have to wrap it up there. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but it flew by. I know there's so much more that you could certainly say for sure, Secretary. But thanks everyone for joining us, and thanks everyone for being a part of this conversation here.